When the pandemic began, my husband and children and I began gathering together each night to watch old sci-fi shows. We did this to establish a family routine because time had lost all meaning, but also because we found comfort in fictional dystopias. Outrageous plots had become relatable. We started with Lost, the story of confused people trapped in a place they cannot leave while being bombarded with surreal crises fomented by a variety of conspiratorial madmen. We continued with Fringe, The Twilight Zone, and the short-lived 1991 children's series Erie, Indiana. One night, we watched an Erie, Indiana episode about a man called the Donald, who comes to town posing as a successful businessman, turns people into zombies through subliminal advertising, and tries to steal their souls because he doesn't have one of his own. The Donald, revealed to be the devil in disguise, is defeated by his most feared nemesis, the IRS. In the early 1990s, Donald Trump, being a consummate tax cheat, was so well known that children were expected to understand it as an in-joke. My own children got the reference instantly in 2021, just as I had as a child when it originally aired. Meanwhile, on cable, reality took a holiday, with Deja News continuing unabated even as administrations changed. Trump's tax dodging was reported as a shocking breaking story, while his actual tax returns remained hidden. First by Trump's Secretary of the Treasury, Steve Mnuchin, and then by Biden's Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen. We were watching old fiction while living real-life reruns. While Lost proved relatable and Erie, Indiana educational, my ultimate plague comfort TV show was The X-Files because of its wild conceit that competent people work at the FBI. "Time for civics class," I would yell to the kids, and we would gather together to watch the opening credits mantras. The truth is out there. Trust no one. Deny everything. Fight the future. These were the baseline beliefs of the 1990s, when distrusting authority was common, and then commodified. I had just turned 15 when The X-Files debuted, putting me at the tail end of its Gen X target audience. I have wondered if Gen Xers are more attracted to conspiracy theories, and possibly more adept at deciphering them, because they grew up in an era of information scarcity and enjoyed the process of search and discovery. The last generation to have an analog childhood, we spent our youth hunting down obscure movies, music, and magazines, developing selective expertise and curated collections. Building up that knowledge was beyond a hobby for many. It was a journey. We were raised in an era of ubiquitous corruption and lies. Watergate and Vietnam in the 1970s, Iran-Contra and white-collar crime in the 1980s and early 1990s. When you combine political cynicism with an obsessive urge to track things down, you wind up with a bootleg culture of information exchange. Now that there is minimal effort required to get even the most obscure pop culture, Gen Xers have become hipsters of conspiracy, losing themselves in state secrets and creating communities of like-minded individuals stymied in their quests for the truth. This undertaking can, of course, go awry. Obsessive information analysis is what QAnon does as well, and members of Gen X flood its ranks. MAGA and QAnon rallies may well be filling in for the cheap concerts and high-octane events that Gen Xers, and boomers for that matter, grew up thinking would last forever.
Thank you for listening to this clip provided to you by Macmillan Audio. To hear more, look for this title wherever audiobooks are sold.
I'm Sarah Kendzior, the author of the bestsellers The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight, and of the new book, They Knew, How a Culture of Conspiracy Keeps America Complacent, which is out right now and which you heard an excerpt of at the opening of the show.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker, and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones about Stalin's genocide famine in Ukraine. A book. I'm on book mode because of Sarah. A film that the Kremlin doesn't want you to see. They keep shutting down screenings.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the United States and rising autocracy around the world. I'm just going to give a very quick announcement, book tour related thing. I'm traveling all over the place because of They Knew. And so I'm going to be in Columbus, Ohio on September 28th. And then I'm going to Calgary for WordFest. I'll be doing 2 presentations over the weekend. So if you're in Columbus or in Calgary, please come by.
And you have a shot to come on our show, Gaslit Nation, and hang out with us. We are calling on our listeners to tweet at Gaslit Nation on Twitter and let us know what you're doing this all important election season to help get out the vote. And from the submissions that we get, just people like tweeting at us, just saying, hey, here's what I'm doing to get out the vote in my community. We're going to select around 5 people and invite you on Gaslit Nation. We'll all get together and talk about what we did, what our experiences were like, how they informed us as citizens, inspired us, and so on. I myself am going to be making, for my own personal goal, 1,000 phone calls this year. I'm going to start by making phone calls for Reverend Raphael Warnock in Georgia, Stacey Abrams in Georgia, Tim Ryan in Ohio, Mandela Barnes in Wisconsin, Val Demings in Florida, and I'm going to find a bunch of House candidates also to make phone calls to. Fetterman, of course, in Pennsylvania, and Mark Kelly in Arizona. If we fight like hell, if you join me in making phone calls, if you set yourself a personal goal that's big and crazy, like 1,000, all right, you may not get that goal because it's a lot, but you might get very close to it. You might do more phone calls than you thought you could. That's the whole point of big old moonshots. And so you shoot for the moon, you land in the stars. That's what we're doing. And so just tweet at us, tell us what you're doing. And from those tweets we receive, 5 folks will come on the show and hang out with us and do an episode of Gaslit Nation. It's always a lot of fun. And it's some of our favorite episodes that we've done since the start of the show. The other way you can get involved with us and hang out in spirit, in ghostly gobbling spirit, is by submitting a Halloween themed radio play, which we're going to produce into a creepy crawly radio show. And your prompt is capturing the mood in this country, the big posh Trump monsters that lurk among us, Ivanka, Jared, whatever you feel like writing about, just get it out there in the form of a ghost story around a campfire, and submit that to us at our email account, gaslitnation@gmail.com, gaslitnation@gmail.com, and we will produce one of those shows and run it around Halloween in time for Ivanka's birthday.
Very, very, very spooky stuff. Like I said, I've been on tour, so we're kind of just freewheeling it here today on Gaslit Nation. And I just have, some thoughts about our upcoming midterm elections and also what's happening in Iran. Because as we've seen over the last few weeks, there have been record protests, at least the biggest protests since 2009, against the dictatorial theocracy of Iran. And they've been primarily led by very young women, by women in their teens, in their early 20s. They were prompted by the assassination of 22-year-old Mahsa Amini, who had been detained by Iran's morality police for, as they say, improperly wearing her hijab. We've seen a lot of women, rejecting the hijab, showing their hair in defiance of, the Iranian theocratic police state. And of course, this is similar in many ways to the debates we're having as American women who have lost our bodily autonomy. Is choice. It's the choice to wear a hijab. It's a choice to do what you want to do, with your own body, with your own sense of self, to present yourself to the world as you please, and to control your own behavior and actions and not have to be subservient. And so it's very moving to see all of these women, especially these young women, standing up and risking their lives. It's chilling to think how long this theocratic state has lasted. Like, it's been there since Andrea and I were born. And of course, back in 1979, people thought this may be a passing thing, a temporary thing. And they're still dealing with these problems. And so, that brings me to the topic of the fact that on paper, at least, Iran is a democracy. Iran has a parliament. Iran has elections. Iran has term limits. The problem is Iran also has a supreme leader, an Ayatollah, that controls the judiciary. And the Ayatollah chooses the judges of that judiciary branch. At least they're fanatical, theocratic, brutal judges, at least rotate. Ours are entrenched for life. But, I think Iran offers a very valuable lesson in the different ways that governments can assert power, that you don't always have electoral autocracy, which is, what brought in Hitler or Mussolini. And, if we're going to pretend that the 2016 election was fully legitimate, brought in Trump, a proto-autocrat. This is when the people vote into power somebody who intends to subjugate them and strip them of their rights. But it is through an election. It is not always that. It is sometimes the judiciary that act as the cage bars of democracy. And that's been steadily increasing in the United States. And so as we move into the midterms, and obviously you should vote and you should try to change the balance of power, particularly in the Senate. Let's remind, the Democrats have the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and have not been able to pass the majority of things that Biden ran on. They have been able to pass some things, but there have been a lot of losses along the way. And of course, the biggest losses came not from Congress, but from the Supreme Court, from the repeal of Roe versus Wade. And you're going to see more losses over the next few weeks. Amani Gandhi, who we had on the show previously, who warned that Roe would be repealed years in advance, is warning that this may be the most brutal Supreme Court term in the recent history of this country, and that democracy may not survive it. And it's because the court has too much power. It has power that supersedes Congress and immediately affects our lives. Like, I live in Missouri, so I don't have bodily autonomy. I might look like I hold some kind of power in the world. Like, I write books, I'm talking to you on this show, people listen to me about things. I don't have bodily autonomy. And it's a very frightening thing. It makes me afraid to go to the doctor, even though I've done nothing wrong. It makes me afraid about, what are in my text messages. It makes me afraid about my friends and my friends' daughters and all of our future. This is something that the state of mind that I am entering in, like, as somebody who studied autocracy my whole life, as somebody who should be able maybe to ward off the psychic hold, the chokehold on me, it's very difficult to do that. And that is the kind of framework that they want to create nationally. That is what this radical right-wing Supreme Court wants to do. And so I just want to stress to you that, yes, of course, vote in the election. I have to say this too, because I live in Missouri and they made a rule where it is illegal for a Missouri resident to register more than 10 voters. It cannot, as Spinal Tap said, go to 11. So I'm going to clarify that I am not registering anybody right now. If you register to vote, don't blame me. I had absolutely nothing to do with it. I'm just freewheeling. As I said, didn't plan anything, just shooting the shit about election stuff. So anyway, my point is, as you can see, we do not live in a full democracy, and we need to try to preserve one. We need to try to create one. And so we need to look at the systems of power that exist outside of Congress, in part to try to stop them from taking our rights, but also to build networks of community and support and protests and think creatively. Like, even if, Biden has promised to codify Roe versus Wade, for example, if he gets 2 more senators, he promised that over the weekend. And so I kept thinking, well, what if the Democrats lose the House, though? and it doesn't even go to the Senate, then that's nipped in the bud. But even if it does go through, they codify it, the Supreme Court can then shoot it down. So this is a crisis. Like, I'm sorry to be Captain Bring Down or whatever, but this is the reality of the situation. And I don't want our country to go through what these women in Iran have to go through, where they're being shot by police on the streets because they are fighting for their rights. And I don't want us to become conditioned anymore to accept this unfairness, to accept this brutality in the way that I can already feel my own mind becoming conditioned to live a life of fear because I'm a woman. So we need to support each other here. We need to get creative. We need to have backup plans for everything, like backup plans B through Z. Saying that you want a backup plan is not voter suppression, which is what some folks are saying on the internet. A backup plan is necessary when you live in a country with encroaching autocracy, or in some cases where there are already autocratic measures in place. Every marginalized group in America has had a backup plan for various situations. I have Black friends who, when they're driving around through certain areas, have backup plans in their mind about how they approach the police. They don't say to the police, oh, but we are a nation of laws, because they know they're going to be discriminated against. And, this is true for everyone. This is why women run around clutching their keys at night, because we know that if we're attacked, people might not believe us. Like, this is an unfair country. So backup plans are good. Vigilance is good. Being creative is good. And having each other's backs are good. And that's basically all I have to say about that. We have lots of other stuff to discuss. Andrea, do you have responses to that? Or do you want to go into something? Do we have anything less dire? Everything we have is dire.
All dire all the time. The backup plan is obviously what we always say on this show, and what's in the Gaslit Nation action guide on our website, gaslitnationpod.com, which is do what you can wherever you live, build community wherever you live. It's so, so incredibly essential, especially as we head into the next 30 or so years, which is just going to be a time of constant change and constant displacement as the climate crisis hits, and as Putin's war and other wars by other dictators inevitably drag on. So what you need to really do is know your community, be a part of your community, even if you have to start it yourself. Don't be afraid to start something yourself with your friends. Even if you have to be unfashionable for a time, if you're alone and doing something, if you build it, they will come. If you build it, they will come. If you don't know where to start, go to the Gaslit Nation action guide on gaslitnationpod.com. It's just critical to do. One thing that I've observed over the years with the Russian resistance is that they sort of got around too late to the whole notion of running for local office or getting people in locally and organizing in a really big way. Political parties, voting, getting out the vote, all those things, they came to it far too late, and they lost a lot of time. Don't be like that. Start early. Acknowledge that as dark as things are, we still have a luxury of rights left in this country, obviously compared to places like Russia and Iran. You have, as we just saw on the news, a Mussolini fan win an election and become the first female prime minister, likely, of Italy. This is somebody who thinks Mussolini's great, somebody that has deep ties to Steve Bannon. Steve Bannon was treating Italy like his own little petri dish of fanning the flames of fascism. Like, he was trying to get a fascist school off the ground. Authorities there put a stop to it, but he still was obviously successful in helping build a far-right extremist coalition headed by Giorgia Meloni, and they just won, and she's going to be the new leader of Italy. That's very scary stuff, right? So here you have Ukrainians for many years now, since the Revolution of Dignity, Euromaidan in 2013, 2014, all those protesters rose up and stood off face to face with the riot police, government snipers by Yanukovych, the Trumpian Putin puppet of Ukraine who fled to Russia. But you had Ukrainians giving their lives to join the European Union, to be part of Europe. And here you have Italians basically threatening that experiment of the EU, right? Here you have enough Brits who voted to leave the EU. You have Hungary becoming an electoral autocracy, a dictatorship light, And enough Hungarians are voting for that, for what Ukrainians, as we speak, are giving their lives for. So never, ever, ever take for granted whatever you have left. Don't stay in your despair too long. You can feel despair. Despair is okay. It's a healthy reaction to how overwhelming things are today. But don't stay there. Don't stay there. Be like the Ukrainians and rise up and fight with whatever resources you have. Make the most of wherever you are. That's the Ukrainian way of doing things. Don't be like the Russian way of doing things where you fall into like a doom spiral of nihilism where nothing matters. Anything you do, what's the point? Before recording this, I was on the phone with a friend from Russia, and I kept asking him, like, what's the Russian diaspora doing? What are you guys up to? How are you helping the fight? What are you guys doing? And the Russian resistance is in shambles. It's in really bad shape. It's never been worse. Putin is at his weakest, but the Russians in the diaspora, which have been growing larger in numbers since this whole brain drain has been going on over the last 2 decades of Putin's corruption. And it's just obviously getting worse, as we see in the news, with Russians fleeing abroad when the war first started, at the big genocidal war earlier this year, and then now fleeing abroad in even larger numbers as mass mobilization and a Russian military draft has been launched. You would think all of those Russians fleeing abroad into democracies across Europe and North America, you would think that they would regroup and try to take back their country. They would energize themselves. No, it's been not that at all, at all. There's no equivalent of Ukrainian groups that are like that have been blooming since Euromaidan and just growing stronger. There's no Russian equivalent to those efforts. I think it's shameful. I don't think there's any good excuse for it. And when I pressed my Russian friends and, what the hell are you guys doing? I'm met with just despair and nihilism. When you talk to Ukrainians, I'm met with excitement, civic spirit, a feeling of we have to fight, we have no choice but to fight, and this larger spiritual religion of freedom, this idea of freedom and self-reliance, just this feeling of a total defiance. And that's where you have to be, even when the odds are against you, even when people are trying to wipe you out and deny your very existence. You have to absolutely be defiant. Wherever you are in the world, whatever you're working with, be defiant. Be defiant. Stare into the disgusting face of evil and just stare it down and be defiant. And just the fact that you exist is enough that matters. And now shine your light out there and join with others, and together your light will be stronger.
Yeah, 100%. I think be defiant is great advice. I think be defiant, it's active advice, and it's a jolt against the sort of hopium that's often peddled, this sort of passivity, like you just sit there and wait for a savior and everything works out fine. I think what we're seeing in Russia, it reminds me a lot of what I saw in Uzbekistan during the Krymov regime. He was the original dictator of Uzbekistan. He started out as a Soviet apparatchik, became the first and only president of independent Uzbekistan until he died in 2016. And just like Putin, just like any dictator who's left in power for a long time, he became more paranoid, more insular. The country fell into shambles. It was collapsing economically before his death. But what was sad and interesting to me, what I was looking at when I was a graduate student was how it affected the mentality, of people in Uzbekistan. And it's sort of wild, like the term woke has entered the American vernacular, like it came from Black Americans who very badly wanted the rest of the country to learn accurate history, to understand systemic racism and injustice. When I would translate from Uzbek into English, what they were trying to do, the word that I would end up with is woke. They would want people to be woke. And so this is how I was describing the desire from Uzbek dissidents for the rest of their population, because they felt like everyone was in kind of a stupor. But it was more of a stupor like what Andrea is describing with Russia, like a kind of nihilist, none of this matters. We're just sort of, in Uzbekistan, a lot of it was just about survival, but it was also a sense of like, even if we do things, why bother? This is just not what we do. And, I'm very opposed to this idea that a lot of psychologists have, that there is such a thing as a innate authoritarian mindset, that like people are just born with a quote authoritarian personality. Like, I don't think that's true. I think people change. I think nothing is predetermined. It's certainly not biological in any way. But I do think that when you grow up in a dictatorship, when you grow up in a certain kind of culture where the incentive is to be asleep, the incentive is to be in a stupor, then an authoritarian mindset can settle in. And it's a combination of fear and complacency. And so you have an obligation to yourself to not give in to that, to remain vigilant, at least in your mind. Like you may, if you live in a dictatorship, you go through the motions of what the state wants you to do for your own survival. And I feel terrible for people who have to do that. Like it is not easy to get out into the streets. You can, and you'll just get shot to death. That is what is happening in Iran now. But the mentality, though, your imagination and your vision of morality and your expectations, like those are what you can control. And if you keep them, when there's an opening, when there is a political opening, that is when you can use it. And maybe, Andrea, you could give your thoughts about whether there is a political opening now in Russia that is not being used. Because to me, it looks like there is, like that Putin has become weaker. He's losing a disastrous war. He's lost the support of ethnic minorities within Russia, Dagestanis and others who don't want to be recruited into an evil and losing military project. Like this seems like the time to rise up. It seems like maybe there'd be some support. And then the question becomes, why not?
I want to start this by pointing out when people in the West see the brave Russians that dare to go out in the street and protest. And there's always this attitude of like, wow, they're extraordinarily brave. And that is absolutely true, without question, because these guys are getting rounded up and arrested, many of them beaten, and it's just sadism, right? The sadist riot police in Russia. It's extremely brave what they do. And I've always said on this show that at the same time, even before Russia invaded, Ukrainians, like Russians, had their share of brutal repression against them by the state. You'd have Ukrainian journalists murdered, Ukrainian opposition figures and activists attacked, murdered, killed. Brutal images circulating across Ukrainian social media of horrific things done to Ukrainians that dare to speak truth to power, dare to stick their neck out, dare to take on corrupt forces. You had all sorts of violent corruption that Ukrainians have been up against since attaining political freedom from Russia, from with the end of the Soviet Union. So what is the difference? Like, why was Ukraine able to finally break through and achieve a democracy where for so long Russians did not? With Russians versus Ukrainians, Ukrainians would have a protest. They wouldn't just go out into the streets. They would live in the streets. They would stay camped out in the bitter cold of the winter months for weeks, months on end, however long it would take. And they did that twice in large enough numbers in two different revolutions, in the Orange Revolution 2004 and the Euromaidan Revolution of 2013, 2014. With Russians, they would protest and then they'd go home. There's never any camping out in the street. There's never any full-on pitch fiery battles with the riot police. And Ukrainians' attitude now, when you read Ukrainian social media with Ukrainian journalists and activists, they watch the protests in Russia, and where we as an American audience would go, oh my gosh, that's so brave of those Russians, the Ukrainian observers will look at the Russians and say, you guys are amateur hour. And you have to understand that there's why Ukrainians feel that way when they see the Russians protesting and they see amateur hour. They see Russians running from the riot police. Me personally, I don't know what I would do. I don't want to make judgment on people when I haven't even been anywhere close to that situation. But I'm just saying from a Ukrainian perspective, the Russian resistance isn't brave to them. They see the Russian people, the average Russian, as zero help in the fight against fascism. They see them as like how we Americans might see Merrick Garland. Like, where the hell are you? Why aren't you doing your job? Why aren't you pulling your weight? Why aren't you pitching in? Why can't you do the bare minimum? That's how Ukrainians see Russians. And it's extremely important for people to understand that, because there is a big question mark around the Russian people, right? Because yes, Putin is incredibly weak at this. He's never been weaker. He's losing control of a war that he's losing at great financial cost to the entire country, to especially his oligarchs. He's isolated. He has Russia and India, who are the only powers really that will do business with him, like scolding him on the global stage. He's going through all sorts of humiliations, which we listed in the last episode. And now he's unleashed the chaos of a major mobilization, which he dared to call it in true Kremlin gaslight fashion a partial mobilization. No, it's a full mobilization. They're claiming they need 300,000, but other documents show that they're going to go up to 1 million Russians. They're going to go up to 1 million Russians that they're going to force over there. And right now, they keep dipping from the same damn well, which is the ethnic republics trapped inside Russia. These are regions of Russia that could be basically their own countries if it wasn't for Russian imperialism. These are republics that have their own language, their own unique history, culture, independent from Russian. They have their own personal identity, their own cultural saints, if you will, that they worship. They're unique from Russia through and through. And they're basically just cursed, like Ukraine, by geography. They've been swallowed up by the Russian imperialist machine and then that's basically now all they know. And they've been colonized mentally, physically, and they speak Russian. And many of them, like Dagestan, have been forced to send their young boys over to Ukraine to be slaughtered. And so when Putin is going to grab all the bodies he needs, because remember, in dictatorships, the dictator wants to own you, mind, body, and soul. So when Putin goes and snatches all the bodies that he needs to send them into a meat grinder, he's essentially at the same time committing genocide against all of these ethnic republics that Russian imperialism has swallowed up. So it's like a twofer, right? It's like he gets to not only commit genocide in Ukraine, but genocide back at home with all these ethnic republics that might otherwise rise up against him because they're tired of the imperialism. They're tired of being subjected to that. They have a stronger push inside of them, like a larger identity that they're not a part of this Russia and they want to break free. As we've said in the show for years, Putin's fascism, Putin's strongman persona, it's a gravity holding Russia together. And the average Russian in St. Petersburg and Moscow fears these republics, fears the civil war that could break out if these republics finally decided to reject Russia in a really big way and fight back and launch some armed uprising. So this mobilization is putting undue stress, just a massive amount of brutality on these republics. And that's where you're seeing the biggest pushback. There's big old riots against the mobilization in Dagestan. Like, for instance, Chechnya, like the warlord who's supposed to be Putin's puppet in Chechnya is saying, hell no, we're not going to send any more people. So the republics that have been bled dry by the first round of the war so far are saying enough is enough already. We're not doing this. And then you have all the rich Russians, the hipsters in Moscow and St. Petersburg. They're the ones that can afford to buy all those overpriced plane tickets to Turkey, Abu Dhabi, Georgia, wherever the hell they can go. Those plane tickets sold out instantly when Putin announced mobilization. They were being completely inflated in price because there are just so few flights left, right? People were paying thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars just to fly out of Russia. You had borders that were overwhelmed by Russians driving, trying to get into countries like Georgia. And so, these aren't necessarily people that are against the war. They can be absolutely in favor or indifferent to the genocide in Ukraine. But once it impacts them, they're not willing to die for it. They don't want to be cannon fodder because Russia's losing this war. Russia's military is absolute shit. It is a victim of Putin's corruption. Putin and his cronies have been just stealing from the state everywhere they can for the last 20 years. And as a result, you have these mobilized Russian soldiers who are being handed ancient, rusty rifles that should be in museums or Civil War reenactments or whatever. Like they're being given essentially movie props to go defend themselves in this country of Ukraine, which is being backed by the rest of the world. And so, what is Putin's strategy? What is the one strategy he has left? Because he's just some lame KGB thug that's got this like caveman mentality, just clubbing people over the head. Well, the only military strategy Putin has left is to attempt to overwhelm Ukraine with meat for the meat grinder. That's all he's going to do. He's going to attempt to spend the next year or so sending around 1 million Russians to their death in Ukraine. And he will be able to find those bodies. Bodies will go willingly for him because enough of these Russians have been so beaten down, so abused, can easily just get kidnapped by the state. They've basically allowed themselves this enslaved mentality. They've allowed their body and their mind to be enslaved to this dictator, and they'll willingly go. Enough of them will willingly go. They'll be able to get 1 million to go. I just want to point out big exciting news. Edward Snowden got Russian citizenship. And the timing, of course, is perfect because Russia has their big old mobilization. Russia officially says one thing, but does the other. Like they're saying, oh, we're not going to take you unless you have military service. Oh, we're not going to take the students. All of it's bullshit, obviously. They've been arresting people off the street and handing them draft. When people are protesting against the mobilization, they've been snatching some of these people, arresting them, handing them draft notices. So they're just desperate to make their quota of 1 million bodies to send into the meat grinder in Ukraine. And you know what? Given how things really work in Russia, Russian citizen Ed Snowden, he totally qualifies to be sent into the meat grinder. I'm just pointing that out. This is a new kind of warfare against Ukraine. Keep in mind, by conservative numbers, Ukraine has either killed or injured around 80,000 Russian troops, around 80,000 Russian troops. If Putin sends 250,000 to 1 million into that furnace, that's going to create all sorts of problems for Ukraine. Think about like the POWs. Now Ukraine has to feed and house and take care of like a massive number of Russian soldier POWs. Ukraine is going to need medical care for all of those injured Russian POWs. Imagine like all of the the corpses left out in the battlefield. The Russians don't claim they're dead. They leave their dead behind. They leave their dead behind for the most part. That's what we've been seeing reports out of Ukraine. What kind of like disaster is that going to create for Ukraine? So Putin's strategy, because he has no other strategy. And keep in mind, Putin himself, like Hitler, who also lost a war, Putin, who has no military experience, Putin is overseeing the war. Putin is like like all decisions start and end with Putin now and overseeing the war strategy in Ukraine. And what he's doing, like a typical KGB sadist, is he's just kidnapping bodies and sending them out to the meat grinder just to overwhelm the enemy, thinking that's going to work. And all it's going to do is create more mass graves, and more mouths for Ukraine to feed and take care of. And it's not a winning strategy by any means. It's just going to prolong the war, increase Putin's pain and destabilization back at home. And it's going to create a lot of problems for Ukraine. And unfortunately, it's just going to be awful. It's just going to be a big mess. Does this mean the end of Putin? Right? Because that's all we're seeing what's happening in Iran. We're seeing what's happening to the theocrats, the Clarence Thomases of Iran. Is this a moment for Putin to be overthrown? The sad reality is that the average Russian, unfortunately, has had a century of really harsh conditions and a lot of state inflicted abuse. And there's probably a lot more that they could take. And so, again, this goes to the start of the conversation. What's really frustrating for the average Ukrainian is that the average Russian is pretty much no help here when it comes to fighting fascism.
You know, the way I see it is basically Putin's goal with this war and just generally with his actions since coming into office and at the end of 1999 was to rebuild the USSR, you know, whose dissolution he saw as the great tragedy of his life and just a great tragedy in general. I think now, you know, over 6 months after his forecasted 48-hour takeover of Ukraine has massively failed, instead of rebuilding the USSR, he has decided to ethnically cleanse it. You know, that is what, you know, as you pointed out from the very start, he wanted to do with Ukraine. And I think by doing these forced conscriptions of non-Russian native populations to the Russian Federation, Dagestanis and others who are resisting this draft, you know, it's to purge them. He wants to purge Russia of especially its Muslim minorities. You're also seeing the surrounding countries, you know, Central Asian countries that used to send young men, or they used to go to Russia to work as migrants because the economic conditions of their own countries were so dismal. You know, they got the hell out of there because they were like, you know, one, it's a shithole country, as someone notably said. And two, you know, we're going to be drafted. Like, we're going to be sent in the meat grinder as well. And we're not even Russian. Although I've heard of some folks, you know, they did join the Russian army because they knew it got them a ticket to Ukraine. And if they went to Ukraine, they might have a chance to actually be free and possibly go to Europe. So there's a lot of complex maneuvers going on there. But I think the situation of, you know, the surrounding countries that were colonized by the Soviet Union, you know, especially the Central Asian states and the Caucasus, and then also these native populations is interesting because this is a long simmering problem. Like at the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union, a Kyrgyz writer, Chingiz Admaitov, he coined this term, mankurt, which is basically like a zombie, somebody who's become zombified because they have lost touch with their own history, their own ethnic homeland, their own identity, to the point, that they will target their own family members because they won't even recognize them because they don't recognize themselves. They have been so thoroughly brainwashed by the state. And this is, of course, after decades and decades of Russians, ethnic Russians at the top from the Kremlin, from Moscow, pushing this idea of Sovietsky Narod, of, the Soviet people, as if Soviet is an ethnic category, and then pretending that everybody is an equal under this ethnic category. But they had a very clear hierarchy where people from Central Asia and the Caucasus were at the bottom. Ukraine was kind of this mixed bag as a Slavic country, but, as Andrea has pointed out, many times, they have always viewed Ukraine as an extension of their territory, as subordinates, as a potential threat, as people who needed to be held down. They certainly viewed people in the Baltics as those who need to be held down. All these countries were invaded. This was not some natural progression where everybody wanted to be, controlled by Moscow. And so this is like a century of historical memory and people who now have access to communications with other repressed peoples from the former Soviet Union, people who are, they may be from different backgrounds, but they're in the same boat in the sense that the Kremlin views them as inferior beings and views them as potential cannon fire to be used against another former Soviet country of Ukraine that they are mercilessly invading in a pathetic way, but, in a brutal way. There are mass graves. And, none of that should be forgotten, that yes, they are losing this war, but this war has had an enormous number of victims and destruction and suffering and refugees. And so I look at Putin and it chills me because, I said this once about Trump. He would rather destroy the world and destroy the United States, certainly, than have himself defeated. Human life means nothing to him. And with Putin, I didn't quite think that was true because, he's an imperialist and he wanted to expand Russia's strength. That's why he was invading other countries. But he's a Soviet imperialist. He wants the Soviet Union back. I'm not sure Russia in its own right means enough to him to get out of this mentality of just sheer brutal destruction. As long as he personally survives it, along with his inner circle, which have become further and further away from him because he, like all dictators there for decades, he's become more paranoid and insular. As long as he survives, I don't think he even cares in the traditional sense anymore. And that means, it could mean a lot of things. It could mean maybe he'll leave. It could mean he ratchets up the use of certain weapons. I don't know. I'm not going to prognosticate. We're looking at potentially a big shift. And I think a lot of it comes from people who've been brutalized and colonized, putting their foot down and saying, no, we're absolutely not doing this for you. And then the Kremlin realizing that they don't have the loyalty of the population. They have just subjugation, and they have people openly revolting at that subjugation.
And I think it's worth soul searching and understanding for the Russian communities out there. So, for instance, in our end credits, we call on people to donate to Razum for Ukraine at razumforukraine.org because they're doing essential work for humanitarian efforts for Ukraine. They're extremely well organized, they're grassroots, they're hands-on. I watched the birth of Razum. Razum came to be during Ukraine's Euromaidan. That was when the Ukrainian government was in the hands of Viktor Yanukovych. It was just a group of friends and strangers and just people just in an emergency room setting, just building something out of nothing. And Razum over the years has had so many incredible events, basic, simple events like how to use social media, how to write an op-ed for your newspaper, how to do fundraising, how to do crowdsourcing, how to overcome the Soviet mentality that many in post-Soviet states were born with, raised on, grew up with, how to kick that, how to free yourself of that. All of these really interesting, fascinating events and fashion shows, art shows, film screenings, book readings, you name it. They just built that themselves. There is absolutely nothing in the US that's the Russian equivalent of that. Nothing. Nothing. And I talked to a Russian friend, as I said before we started taping, and be like, where's your Rosm? Why hasn't there been a Rosm on the Russian side of things? And he was like, oh, because we don't get along. You think Ukrainians get along? It's like, my husband has said that every single member of my Ukrainian family is the emotional equivalent of one Sicilian family. It's like that Slavic like hot blood or whatever. It's like, but when it comes to an existential threat like the Kremlin, we all get into gear and unite, and we put our differences aside and so on. Over the years, I have been embraced and worked with wonderful Russian activists who've taken great risk. I paid tribute to the Russian resistance in my film, Mr. Jones. There's a character who is killed with 4 bullets in his back, and that is, of course, Boris Nemtsov tribute, because that's how he was killed in the shadow of the Kremlin, with 4 bullets in his back. And there have been wonderful Russians that have worked with Rosm and so on. They need more support. They need more numbers. Unfortunately, you have like Gary Kasparov and his group. You have Mikhail Khodorkovsky, a Russian oligarch who had his fortune liquidated, who's thrown in prison, and now he's forced to live abroad. You do have some efforts, but there isn't any sort of like grassroots bottom up rallying. Of course, you have Navalny's group, and they're trying to do God's work, and they keep yelling at Navalny's people, keep saying, please, US, please, EU, please sanction these 6,000 Russians that are part of the corrupt architecture that's holding Putin in power today. 6,000. So we should listen to groups like Navalny's group when they tell us who to sanction, and we should be more active in doing that and doing our part. So I do think it's a twofold thing that we in the US and anywhere in the world need to do more to support the Russian resistance. And that includes just basic services, immigration services, security services, but also help them overcome whatever mentality, whatever lack mentality, whatever fear mentality that they brought with them from living in a dictatorship. I think that's an important part of the support we should give all of these Russians that are now rushing abroad right now. But there is also something deeper there that the Russian people need to soul search themselves. And I think it comes from the fact that they were the top dog. They were the ones that benefited psychologically from empire. It was the Russian language that was forced onto the captive nations for 100 years, in places like Estonia and Lithuania and Ukraine and elsewhere. And it was, the Russian people were held up as the model citizen, as like the great power in a Russian empire. And so maybe a part of this is that there is a bit of entitlement and privilege, whereas groups that have faced genocide, who have been told that they must erase themselves, they must erase their language, they must erase their culture, they must erase their poets and their artists and so on. They cannot speak their mother tongue. Those groups have faced an existential threat, just like non-white people in America. When you face an existential threat, it forces you to be a smart organizer, just like Black women are on the front lines of protecting our democracy and being like the pillar of the Democratic Party, right? When you are faced with that existential threat, when you're told that you don't have a right to exist, suddenly it's like you need to do what you can to be the best organizer possible for yourself and your community in order just to survive. And maybe the Russians for so long have sort of coasted, some of them, on this mentality of being the empire, being the power, being a superpower, being the mysterious great Russian mind that a lot of people around the world have always looked to in terms of culture and arts and so forth. And maybe it's just that entitled privileged mentality is keeping them back from doing the necessary work in order to survive. Because right now, Russia, just like Ukraine is facing an existential threat, Russia, as we know it, is facing an existential threat. If you mobilize 1 million Russians, the vast majority poor, many of them from these ethnic republics, what's going to happen? You're going to basically create a tension across the country that could lead to Russia itself breaking apart.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
Pakistan has been decimated by record floods, and people need help. To help the victims of the floods, donate to Pakistan Emergency Flood Aid at www.launchgood.com/campaign/Pakistan_emergency_flood_aid. Climate and economic crises are everywhere, so please consider supporting your local food bank as well.
We encourage you to help support Ukraine by donating to Razom for Ukraine at razomforukraine.org. We also encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Ukraine, Syria, and Afghanistan. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going.
Our production manager is Nicholas Torres, and our associate producer is Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon and higher. Jess Sauer,
Chick Quinn,
Lily Wachowski,
Sean Rubin,
Todd S. Pearlstein,
Kenny Main,
John Schoenthaler,
Ellen McGirt,
Joel Ferran,
Larry Gasson,
Erica Moore,
Karen A. Deal,
Nico Phillips,
Brian E. Castor,
Tatjana Birch,
Karen Heisler,
Ann Bertino,
Chris Bravo,
T.R. Dunstan,
John Millette,
David East,
Stu,
Shannon Nacy,
Ida,
Ben Wheaton,
Joseph Mara Jr.,
Rich Holcomb,
Thomas Scheibe,
Kelsey Molsom,
Julie Matthews,
Meganopolis,
Barbara Kittredge,
Matthew Womack,
Silas Frank,
Sean Berg,
Kristen Custer,
Tracy Ash,
Kai Gillis,
Sharon Hattrick,
William Barry Reeves,
Richard Smith,
Emmy,
Kevin Gannon,
Mike Christensen,
Sandra Collins,
Katie Masuris,
John Laughlin,
James D. Leonard,
Leo Chalupa,
Carol Gulstad,
Michael Woldridge,
Jason Benke,
Marcus J. Trent,
Joe Darcy,
Ann Marshall,
Jeremy Lewis,
Joel Newman,
Trigve,
D.L. Singfield,
Matt Perez,
Nicole Spear,
Brian Tajuden,
Maureen Murphy,
Abby Road,
Jans Alstrup Rasmussen,
Victoria Olson,
Z.W.,
Lisa LaFlame,
Kathy Kavanaugh,
Sarah Gray,
Mike Tripico,
Diana Gallagher,
Jennifer Ann Luter,
John Ripley,
Ethan Mann,
David Porter,
Kate Cotton,
Leah Campbell,
Lynn Schneider,
Jared Lombardo,
Karen Humphreys.
and Tanya Chalupa.
Thank you all for your support of the show. We could not make Gaslit Nation without you.